blasphemy we read about in the New Testament of the Holy Spirit. I know there's different arguments on this, but I'll just lay out both. The blasphemy of the Holy Spirit is, number one, is to attribute God's work to the work of Satan. That's blasphemy of the Holy Spirit. For example, if the Holy Spirit were to move in a powerful way, and this church would just be hit with the power of God, and people would be healed. I couldn't even get through a sermon. I couldn't even finish because I'm just broken and weeping. And God's hitting this group. There would be people who would leave, and they would mock that. That's emotionalism. I don't know what happened to Pastor Shane. What happened to Pastor Shane is he experienced God at a deep revival type level. But they attribute those works of the Holy Spirit to Satan. Now we have to be careful, right? We don't just allow crazy things to go on. You use discernment. But if a true, and I've noticed when a true work of God hits, a person, a place, or thing, those who are not close to God, those who don't want to get emotional experience God, often refer to that as Satan. Satanic. That's the work of the devil. Now, this isn't even in my notes. I hope this is beneficial because this is going to be a long rabbit trail, maybe. I just thought of this. Every single revival book I read, I can go back to probably the 1700s. I think it was in Wales. People like Hal Harris, Griffin Jones, Daniel Rollins. Now we love them. I have their volumes. It's called the Calvinistic Methodist Fathers of Wales. These two big volumes. And talk about God moving. I mean, and not weirdness, just going into a town and people begin to weep before even getting to church. Bars are closed down. God's moving. But in every single case I read, there were those in established churches that were against these people. That's of Satan. That's of the devil. Then you go into the First Great Awakening. George Whitefield was having a trouble with what was happening at his services. These people I don't know what to do. I don't remember this. It was actually a woman who gave him advice. And she said, George, 5 minutes with God, with God like that is going to do more than a year's worth of your sermons. So George Whitefield caught criticism. John Wesley caught criticism because of God moving powerfully. You get into the Second Great Awakening. Charles Finney, he's called a heretic to many people who don't agree with those types of revival things. And even Azusa Street, I don't know, I wasn't there. 1904, 1905 in LA, you have the Welsh revivals of 1950s. You have Duncan Campbell on some islands and just huge moves of God. You always had those coming against it that were in biblically sound, strong churches. And there are some today, it's interesting, that would call what I'm talking about heretical, or they would mock it from churches close to here in LA. They would mock it. But yet they quote George Whitefield in their sermon. They'll quote Jonathan Edwards in their sermon. But had they lived when that revival broke out in Massachusetts under Jonathan Edwards, they would have called him a heretic. Or they would have said the devil is moving. But see, now they quote him. See, they're always attributing the works. Here's why, because they themselves have not experienced revival of the heart. They are hard, they are rigid, and they are arrogant. So when God breaks a church, breaks a group of people, you know what revival is? God reviving his people. And then when it hits, it's like Christmas times 10. It's just, people are just broken before God, and people do get upset because they're not comfortable with that. So it's interesting. Any book I read, people now, they say, oh, amen, that was great. But back then, if they lived in that time, they would attribute often the works of God to the works of Satan. I mean, I remember I spoke somewhere, and it was about 320 men, and 150, I think I mentioned, like half of the whole thing was at the altar and down the sides, and it was like an hour. I just spent an hour down here praying with the guys, and in a couple of the older gentlemen, well, later, that's just emotionalism. I mean, that's really. Men all tatted up, out of prison, crying at the altar, wanting to go home, being better fathers. That's emotionalism. We got to watch that. What are we allowing, Shane? Well, I don't know, but this is called God. This is God move. Because see, when an earthquake shakes your home, you're going to run outside, right? If you see there's a fire, kids, there's a fire in the house. Let's get outside. So when you experience God, how is that any different? Tell the blind man to be quiet, who cried out, Jesus, oh, Son of David, would you heal my eyes? Yes, you're healed. Now be quiet. Just don't get carried away. Shh. Or the demoniac who was freed of a legion worth of demons. Now, you just sit down, sir. Quiet. Jesus is here. Be quiet. No. Don't get excited. That's not correct. See, it's okay to get excited about all other things. The reason often is God has not penetrated their heart to such a degree that they cannot rejoice in that same experience because they themselves have not or are not experiencing it. So I often say I'm not a fan of just experience. But when you experience the birth of a child, you get excited. When you experience the new birth, you will get excited. When you experience God, God gave us those emotions. Thank God. Thank God for that. People get up, that's just emotional worship. Well, what other kind of worship is there? Boring worship? What's the end? What is that? That's just emotional worship, Shane. Because people will critique this kind of worship that you're hearing this morning. And groups that play this, that's just emotional worship. Okay, what's the opposite to that? Dead, dying worship. Where we just stand and sing a few hymns and sit down. And I'm all for hymns. To me, it doesn't matter what it is. It's the heart is engaged. I mean, if God truly touches you, aren't you emotional? I guess, I hope so. I hope so. You express anger real well. Is anger not an emotion? Oh, I can stay camped out here for a little while if you'd like. You express lust real good. Isn't lust an emotion? And anger, see, we have all these emotions, but when it comes to worshiping God, we've got handcuffs. And we often attribute the things of God to either Satan or that's not real, that's not genuine. And this is a big passion for me because I see it a lot. Any church that is alive and on fire for God, worship, any time you get somebody who's not feeling that, they might know their Bible. They might have sound doctrine, but they walk into it, they're like, oh, that's just too emotional. That's not of God. These people are lunatics. They're out of their mind. Wait a minute, we're fasting, we're praying, we're loving our spouse, we're loving our kids, we're changing. Our hearts are changing, we're becoming united, we want more of God. That's not of the devil, sir. You might have the wrong spirit in you yourself.